It seems like everywhere you look, we are reminded that there is evil and suffering in this world. You turn on the news and you learn about the latest murder, the most recent riot, the fighting and wars that are taking place all over the world. Or our hearts ache when we see children who are starving or a loved one dies in an accident. Not too long ago, I stood in a hospital room just like this one, while a mother and a father removed life support from their son who had terminal brain cancer. And the question that they were gripped with, as they didn't understand that whole situation, they were asking that question, why? It's a question that's been asked throughout the ages. Couldn't God do something about this? If God is real and if God is loving, why does He allow so much evil and suffering to go on in this world? And the short answer is that the reason evil and suffering exists is because man rebelled against God. And sin, along with all the effects of sin, evil and suffering, it entered into the world. And it goes all the way back to the opening book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 3. And I think it's important that we understand that sin never just affects us. It has far-reaching consequences. And all of the evil that you and I see happening in our world today is all because man has turned his back on God. And it seems like this question opens up even more questions, such as, well, couldn't God foresee that this was going to happen? That people would rebel against Him? Couldn't He have seen that in advance? And the answer is, well, of course. So why did God bother to create us anyway? I think the best answer is using the analogy of what it's like to be a parent. Those of you who are watching this and you're already a parent, you can easily understand, because you knew before you had your first kid that there was the very real possibility that your child would endure suffering, pain, and hardship in their life, didn't you? You knew that they would have some disappointments and failures in their lives, and you also knew that there was a likely possibility that perhaps when they grew up, they might even reject you as a parent and walk away and cause you a lot of grief and a lot of heartache. And yet, knowing the very real possibility of all of that, you went ahead and had kids anyway. So why did you do it? Well, whether you gave a lot of thought to it or not, it's because you also knew that there was a potential for tremendous joy and a loving relationship that you would have in that child made in your own image. And so God made the same choice when He chose to create you and me and the entire human race. God knew that many would rebel against Him because of our own free will. But He also knew that many people would choose to follow Him. They would choose to love others. They would choose to spend eternity with Him in heaven. And God knew it was all worth it, even if it meant for Him the suffering and the death of His Son Jesus on the cross. We need to understand that there's coming a day when God is going to put an end once and for all to evil and suffering. For those who are followers of Christ, a mere 1,000 years from now, the worst suffering you've ever experienced here on this earth will be but a distant memory in eternity. There's a Christian woman who had lived a life of deprivation and suffering, and at the end of her life, she said this. She said, "In light of heaven, the worst suffering on earth, a life of the most atrocious tortures on the planet, will be seen to be no more serious than one night in an inconvenient hotel." God's ultimate answer to the problem of suffering is not an explanation, it's the incarnation. I'd have a hard time loving a God who is watching all of this suffering from afar off. I could never love a God who is at a distance, who is disinterested in what was happening here, who is detached. But I cannot help but love a God who says, I will enter into your suffering with you. I'll enter into your pain. And I will come into your world and suffer a death on the cross for you so that you might have eternity in heaven. As one philosopher said, Jesus is there sitting beside us in the lowest places of our lives. And so Jesus is the answer to the question of suffering.